Welcome to Stereo 3D Productions and this first impressions video of the PiMax 8K virtual reality headset. This headset is not one I own, but thanks to my workplace, I was able to borrow one for a little bit over a weekend. The idea of borrowing the headset for the purpose of a first impressions video came to me after I had used the PiMax a few times for some projects at work. From the capabilities I had seen, I wanted to spend a little one-on-one time with it so I could determine how well it works for regular gaming and how close this actually is to a final product. I'm going to go over this in the correct order. That being, introducing the hardware, followed by the setup to get going with the headset, then the software setup, and finally, based on the games and experiences I've tried, how things went with various titles run in the PiMax. I do have a pretty solid determination of what I think about this headset, but keep in mind, compared to the HTC VIVE or the Oculus Rift, my experience with this unit is far more limited, which is why I consider this video to be more along the lines of a first impressions rather than a detailed review. Still, that doesn't remove the fact that I've done insane amounts of virtual reality in the past 5 years, and I've come to be able to quickly recognize what makes VR better in a short span of time. The PiMax 8K has a pretty simplistic design. It's very wide given its twin 2160p display panels, each with a 16:9 aspect ratio, and has a fairly aggressive inward angle between the screens so as to utilize as much of the screen surface as possible. I'm not quite sure why they call this headset 8K, since true 8K is actually 4320p, effectively equivalent to 4K display panels joined together. But put terminology aside, this is the highest pixel density I have ever seen in any VR headset. It's more like twin 4K rather than true 8K. It's got what I've come to expect from any headset in the industry. The face foam has Velcro, and it's removable, which has proven extremely important for hygiene down the line with the commercial VR headsets I own today. The Rift didn't even have this, and I was forced to buy a VR cover kit so that I could swap and wash face foams regularly. The part I don't like here, and this does affect hygiene very negatively, is these guys went with the same awful notion of using fabric to cover from dust between the lenses. I hate this concept. The Rift has the same problem, and to this day, I haven't had the confidence to remove the fabric without potentially damaging the headset. Which means this part is very hard to clean, yet it's a part you'll actually really need to clean. I've found some ways of keeping this god-awful fabric tidy, but it's extra work, it's not as efficient as plastic you just wipe off, and it generally pisses me off as a design choice. Fuck this fabric. When it comes to the optics, I was pleased to find that these lenses are somewhere between Oculus and Vive. There's some pretty strong thin ridges in these, but unlike the Oculus, they really won't produce any unwanted God rays. It's a pretty clear sight in there. However, at the outer edges of the lenses, they screwed something up fierce. See, this headset's largest selling point, past its very high resolution, is its ability to deliver an enormous horizontal field of view. The problem here is that while the VR headset lenses are supposed to unwrap the image output to fill as much of your field of view as possible, these optics severely mess up the outer edges of your field of view. While the horizontal field of view is supposed to be around 200 degrees, only about 60% of that is outputting correctly in the headset, say 120 degrees. Because of these lenses, the rest of the view on the outer edges is distorted and blurred to the point of near uselessness. Fortunately, the runtimes allow you to reduce this headset's field of view. But still, that's a pretty major screw-up to have lenses that unwrap the image incorrectly to your eyes. I'll go on more about this field of view problem in the setup and gameplay sections of this video. Now, the PiMax doesn't come with any controllers or trackers. It's on you to already be the owner of either a full HTC VIVE kit or at least 2 VIVE lighthouses and a pair of VIVE controllers. Without this hardware, the PiMax will only work as a seated headset with only rotational tracking and absolutely no positional tracking. I do have to mention that given the price of this headset, this is less than advantageous. Buying a pair of controllers and 2 tracking stations brand new can set you back a good $500 in addition to this headset's hefty retail tag of $900. In a sense, there might be an advantage to this, given someone might have previously owned a Vive and wished to upgrade their experience by simply replacing the headset and keeping the old trackers and controllers. But that's a long shot to me, since an upgrade implies you're making every aspect better. And with that price tag, one could argue that you're paying for potentially 2 next-generation VR kits. Okay, at a first glance, this is a big headset, and this is not a very valid argument when it comes to VR, because once it's on your face, you don't really care what it looks like, but damn, this is a big headset and it is one ugly beast. This has to be the ugliest headset on the market right now. I gotta say, they really didn't have much choice. They're using 2 16:9 panels inside of this beast, so they did the best they could, but it's still pretty ugly. That put aside, I was surprised to find out that the weight is only 500 grams. You might think that's a lot, but that sort of lines up with the other commercial VR headsets, and it is really, by its appearance, should be heavier than it is. When you put this thing on, you first realize, hey, this won't be as uncomfortable as it looks. It does not really sag on your face. It's a nice, firm fit, and it really just isn't as heavy as it may appear. But damn, I gotta re-mention it. It is not pretty. Connecting this thing is actually really simple, and they did something pretty cool. We all have DisplayPort slots in our video cards nowadays. Well, screw HDMI. This comes with its own DisplayPort connectors. You won't have to mess around with adapters, and I'm almost sure most of you will have a DisplayPort slot free on your video card. We don't really use them commonly. We're still using HDMI a lot, or we're using adapters to expand with more monitors. So that's a really cool thing. It's straight in, no adapter, no nothing. And obviously a USB connection. And this isn't necessarily old school because the Vive does it too, but there's an AC adapter that you connect here and plug into the wall or in your power bar. It's 12 volts. It's an AC-DC adapter, 12 volts, and they recommend 2000 milliamps or 2 amps. I managed to get this working with a 600 milliamp adapter. Thing is I took this from the office in kind of a haste. It was the end of the day. I asked if I could borrow it. They said yes, so I just grabbed it and left. Completely forgot about the power adapter, but with a universal adapter, 600 milliamps, much lower than what I should be using, everything worked fine. So I was lucky, I guess, in that respect. But setting this up in terms of connecting it to your computer, pretty quick. It then comes to configuring with the software. Once you have your headset plugged in, you just need to have your Vive trackers and controllers ready to go, and you're almost in business. The next step is to download a piece of software called PiTool, which will allow you to configure the headset, confirm that your tracking is working, and finally get it to pass through SteamVR when you're ready to launch an app or a game. PiTool is fairly simple and surprisingly well presented. The first screen shows you your headset's status, including which base stations are tracking, what controllers you have paired, and so on. In the Settings tab, you first have a few general settings, including the ability to enable or disable PiMax Home, basically their version of SteamVR Home, and you also get to check for software updates there. Under the HMD tab is where things get interesting. First notable feature is the ability to enable or disable lighthouse tracking. If you plan on using this headset without base stations, you can go ahead and uncheck this setting, and the headset will simply track itself on every rotation axis without positional. I had to use this option here, as you'll see later, the base station setup gave me endless problems to the point where I ended up using the headset with this option unchecked for quite a while. There's a hidden area mask setting, which is supposed to improve performance and can be turned off if it causes compatibility issues. Then there's the brightness setting, which can come in handy, especially with games that are so bright it feels like you're staring straight into the sun. The HTC VIVE and Oculus Rift screens are really strong and can actually hurt the eyes sometimes, so it's nice to see this option in VR runtimes. Just it was a bit useless with this headset since it's not nearly as bright as the two others I own. Last in this category is resolution quality. It can range from 0.5 to 2.0. For most of my test sessions, I ran this between 0.5 and 1.0. I really did not find the need to go higher than 1 since, first off, SteamVR has an option that will further affect this setting and can go very high even if you have PyTool on 0.5 here. Also, going too high on super sampling, increased resolutions, will eventually cause your system to drag its feet intensively no matter what kind of hardware you have. Yes, visuals are important, but most often frame rate is even more important. If you're just getting started and want to run anything, just leave this at 1.0, you should be fine. The next and last category, oddly named Brain Warp, contains very important options. First, the Smart Smoothing option. This is something you're going to cherish, especially if you're rendering your games at very high resolutions. Consider it to be like PiMax's version of asynchronous space warp. Now, in my case, I won't have too much to say on it since it did not work on Windows 7, but from what I've seen with the Windows 10 systems at work, it does make a big difference when you're asking resolutions greater than what the system is able to render smoothly. Compatible with parallel projections is another important option. If you're using VorpX, that is. See, initially, loading any game with VorpX would give me what I could call cross-eyed fuckness vision. It simply wasn't playable. Then I learned that by enabling this option, the cross-eyed fuckness would vanish, and sure enough, it did. Rule of thumb, if you're gonna use VorpX, make sure you've checked this box. Field of view is likely the most important option in this app. See, PiMax has this enormous horizontal field of view. It's insane. However, you'll know that the larger your field of view is, the more work a game has to do to render what you're seeing, regardless of what resolution you're running at. It's often a good idea to spare some field of view and trade it off for added performance. The other reason this feature is important is that for various reasons I found the larger field of view setting to be borderline useless and somewhat obnoxious. We'll get to this problem when we cover the games I've had a chance to play. Finally, an option that I was glad to find in this tool is refresh rate. I'm one to find that 90 Hz with the current headsets may have been too high a refresh rate to impose on everything, and that some games could have very well just had the headset run as low as 75 Hz without any smoothness issues whatsoever. It's refreshing to see a headset, no pun intended, with which you can actually control this, allowing you to lower the frame rate requirement on some experiences while still allowing you a really high setting if you wish. I've tried both the 72 and 64 Hz settings in addition to the full 80, and I was impressed at how it wasn't really that easy to tell the difference between each. Okay, so now that you've gone through your entire PyTool configuration, the thing says that both base stations are ready. If you've made it here, all that's left to do is fire up SteamVR with the button on the status screen, power up your controllers in view of the base stations, and you're done. At this point, you can launch any game that supports SteamVR, and it should by all means work right out of the box. Put aside a few issues here and there, issues I'll try to cover throughout the gameplay portion of this video. One little extra thing you can do here is open up the SteamVR settings. Go to the Video tab and adjust your resolution scale. These numbers will vary depending on how you configured resolution quality in PyTool, but here's where we encounter our first problem. The SteamVR numbers, including the percentage recommended in the setting window, will vary for me every time I start this up. Once it suggested I use 56%, another time 36%, and now 38%, all without changing a single setting in PyTool. Also, the resolution numbers themselves seem to have been changing each time I started this, again without touching resolution quality in PyTool. Nothing major, but most definitely strange behavior and likely a software bug. Okay, so you just saw the ideal version of a configuration, but it might honestly not work that well for you. Why do I say this? Because the setup sequence you just saw was recorded when the headset finally decided to detect the goddamn base stations. That's right. PiMax's implementation of VIVE base station tracking is extremely unreliable and will honestly start working when it feels like working. During my time at home with this headset, I performed 5 base station setup attempts and only got successful at the last try. With every other attempt, I'd end up having the headset clearly facing both base stations that are each powered on, and I'm just standing there like a dumbass swinging the headset with the software telling me it can't fucking see the god fucking damn shitting headset. It's right here, you cunt. Please work. I've read the forums and I'm obviously not alone having this issue. There's a lot of recommendations in the replies, ranging from restarting SteamVR to restarting the entire runtime chain down to the PiMax service, and even tricks like deleting Lighthouse configuration files that the runtimes create automatically. To this day, nothing has consistently worked at either setting it up correctly or getting problems to go away. I've literally only got the positional tracking working when the software decided it wanted it to work. On one occasion, I got it working, only to see it lose tracking for like 5 minutes in. On another occasion, it appeared to work, but was only functioning off one of the 2 base stations, and I have no idea why. Some people might say, oh well, this is your personal setup or computer, but I can assure you that no, this isn't the case. I've had the misfortune of facing these same exact problems on 3 other workstations with a different operating system. At home I use Windows 7 while the work systems are using Windows 10, and on every single one of them I'd had nightmares trying to get this goddamn positional tracking to work reliably. There is in fact one of the computers that to this day will periodically lose all PiMax tracking and require several variations of a rain dance to get it working again, with no consistent fix or solution to the problem other than incessantly restarting the runtimes and scrapping configuration files until it decides to please work. Keep in mind that we also have a PiMax 5K Plus, and guess what? We have the same fucking problem with that unit as well, across multiple different computers. It doesn't seem to be a hardware defect, nor does it seem to be a problem with our base stations, since all 6 stations involved in these tests work perfectly with any HTC VIVE kit we fire up in front of them. This is the headset's single largest problem, and if you didn't get the misfortune of having to deal with it, you are blessed, and you're probably liking this headset a lot more than I have. The only saving grace is that this problem is probably software related, and thus it means a future update may finally resolve it, but for now, wow. Enjoy begging the runtimes to pick up your damn headset, because you might have to do it for a while before it responds. The gameplay is where the good stuff really starts. But it also comes along with something bad. Really bad. Before I go through each experience I ran one by one, I have to talk about this enormous, and I mean gigantic, field of view this headset gives. Read the specs and you'll see a stunning 200 degrees horizontal field of view, which is larger than anything I've ever seen in VR. However, because of the lens issue I mentioned earlier, the useful field of view only amounts to about 120 degrees. Things start falling apart up to 150 degrees, and beyond that point the image is warped, blurred, and distorted to a point where it's pretty much useless to have it displayed in the first place. Having my runtime set at the highest field of view setting, here's a frame capture of the entire viewport from both screens. Looks insanely wide, does it? Well, let me highlight for you the only portion of this field of view that's actually 100% useful. In this region, what you see is as clear as can be and will be completely useful for your gameplay. Now, let's highlight the region where things start falling apart. You'll still see fairly well in this portion of the view, but it can be slightly distorted. Last, let's highlight that portion of the field of view that's virtually useless. This is the part of the image where you'd pretty much rather not have it displayed at all. Not only is it not of any use, but this part of the image will be so distorted it's actually distracting to the point where it's obnoxious and it'll take immersion away from you. Now, for the purposes of testing gameplay, in all cases but Bioshock Infinite with VorpX, I ran the headset with PyTools FOV setting on large, so I could see what this headset is supposed to deliver, and this gave me a good deal of information on what this enormous field of view could provide. While I was having problems configuring the positional tracking with this headset, I decided to start testing with the lighthouse tracking option unchecked. I effectively used this headset a lot like the Oculus DK1 used to track, rotation only, seated VR without any positional whatsoever. This took me back to the development days of VR, which was charming for nostalgia purposes, but obviously was a setback in what we're capable of doing today. Keep in mind that these videos were recording using the headset's left eye view through Steam VR. I could have picked center eye to get a complete left to right view of my game, but I figured left only would be sufficient, and the cool thing here is left only did spare my system a bit of work, allowing both my game and the video capture to run a little better. This means what you'll be looking at is the image being sent to the left eye display panel in the headset. The first thing I tried, something I released on the channel already, was Bioshock Infinite with VorpX. I still support the fact that this is the best game to run through VorpX, and I was really curious to see how it fared in this headset. I kept the field of view setting on low and went into play for roughly 2 hours, during which I actually got to see the game's ending. This was by far the session where I most enjoyed the pixel density of these display panels. Yes, performance with games run through VorpX is always less than you'd get out of first-party VR games, so given the resolution of this unit, I had to accept a lot of flaws ranging from the lack of asynchronous time warp. For some reason, time warp is pretty much absent when you use this headset with VorpX, all the way to missed frames and sometimes heavy flickering. Put those issues aside, however, I did end up having a great time playing the game. I was happy to have the chance to see the visual beauty of this game's ending through these display panels. I had the game running at 1440p, and damn, I have to say, even though these displays themselves are 2160p, the image I was looking at had the least amount of aliasing I have ever seen in virtual reality, and I could notice a lot of little detail here and there that I wouldn't have with more recent headsets. As usual with VR headsets, the depth perception factor was spot on. I used my typical depth strength setting in Bioshock Infinite, the one that works in all the other headsets, and I did not get any notable difference. That realistic world scale still shines through perfectly. One problem that will recur a lot through these sessions is the readability of text, which was at the worst I've ever seen in any headset, and this includes the old Oculus DK1. I think it's because of how pronounced the field of view setting has to be with PiMax, but it seems that almost every user interface is crunched down so tiny that you simply cannot read a single damn thing in it. Sure, I managed to read a few things, but it was somewhat painful to do, having to squint and go slow like someone who's got a 420 vision. At first I thought this was an issue because I was running third-party VR using VorpX, but no, this problem continued to manifest itself in all first-party VR experiences I subsequently tried. Now, Bioshock Infinite was a somewhat impressive introduction to the headset, but I had not yet had the chance to give that large field of view a fair shot. I thought of one thing that I could try where an enormous field of view might just benefit me the most: racing. I went ahead and fired up iRacing with the PiMax 8K, this time with a field of view at the max. iRacing has first-party Steam VR support, so I'd get to embark on first-party virtual reality for a first time with this headset. I picked dirt racing, more specifically the Sling Mud for Fun series, which allows me to take my favorite dirt sprint car on the track without having to work my way towards a license allowing me to do so. Sadly, attendance was sparse at best, and we only had 3 cars, including mine, in the session, but this was more than enough to help me evaluate how this headset's large FOV can help. My determination is I could have very well run this session with a field of view setting on normal in PyTool. Yes, sometimes seeing out of the corner of your eye, even though you're not sure what it is you're seeing, can help you have some rough clue of what's going on directly next to you, something that's very important with racing. I did well to pick this type of race since it's a huge advantage to have a large peripheral vision in these cars, particularly when there's someone alongside you, you really want to know they're there and what their car is doing, mostly to prepare for the eventuality that they slide up or down towards you. Bottom line is that distorted outer edge of the view surprisingly proved useful once or twice, but what it did more often than not is distract me. It's so warped that sometimes you'll think it's a car, but it ends up just being the scenery scrolling by. I could have done this whole session with the normal field of view setting, which cuts off about 30 degrees from the total, and I would have had nearly the same amount of useful visual cues with increased immersion because those blurred, distorted outer edges would have been less prominent. Since I've seen iRacing in 5 different headsets by now, including this one, as it should be, the stereoscopic depth perception in this simulation is just as good as you should expect it. And since iRacing's always got their scale spot on through over 5 years of VR support, this was business as usual, no issues there. Other notable factors in this run were the fact that iRacing's UI was extremely hard to read. I had to do guesswork whenever entering a menu, and thankfully I know this simulator end-to-end so well, I pretty much know the menus by heart. Honestly, about 90% of the text is absolutely impossible to read, likely because the UI is crunched down relatively to the enormous field of view size. Lastly, it must be said that iRacing performed excellently with the headset on an 80Hz display setting. This session was simply not comparable to my run of Bioshock Infinite. The simulator performed well enough that I didn't visibly notice a single drop in frame rate, despite running the thing at 1440p. The next thing I fired up, another vehicle simulation, while still using the large field of view and similar settings, Elite Dangerous. Again, I ran this one with no positional tracking, a la Oculus DK1, and the objective here was, this being another vehicle simulation, to see if I'd like playing it with the headset's largest field of view setting. At this point during my testing, I started being very disappointed with the PiMax. The uglier aspects really started to show up. First, as with most games so far, a substantial part of the text displays were unreadable. Sure, the stuff on larger buttons and functions was fine, but when it came to smaller text, forget it. I could barely make out anything unless I had already seen it before in another headset and could guess what it was saying. This time around, the large field of view not only proved useless, but it was a lot more distracting than anything I had seen so far. The warped outer edges were very prominent, since with the high contrast nature of the game, your lit up spaceship cockpit over black empty space, I was constantly distracted by that blurred up, distorted to fuck view on the sides of my cockpit. This truly impaired immersion and kept reminding me that I'm wearing a headset, one that has incredibly flawed lenses. The biggest disappointment, however, was not the field of view. I already knew the large field of view came with its share of issues. What I was not prepared for is how poorly these displays perform in high contrast. All of a sudden, I could make out some strong SDE, or screen door effect. It seemed that the pixel pattern used in these displays is different from the OLEDs used in the Rift and the VIVE, and it really shows when you've got a game with such high contrast like this. I found myself being able to see the individual pixels on the orange text, and often, when there was a bright line over a dark background, I could see the shimmer and gaps between the pixels. I did engage in combat during this test to see if this headset would give me any perceivable advantage, and honestly, not only didn't I notice any, but about halfway in the session I started wishing I was using the Oculus Rift or the VIVE instead. I really didn't find any benefit to the faulty large field of view, the supposed pixel density, or the headset's overall qualities. This was very much my most disappointing run with the PiMax and has remained so through the rest of my session. With 4 failed attempts to configure the lighthouse tracking behind me at this point, I decided to persist and try again because I wanted to get at least one session with positional tracking out so I could form a more solid opinion on this headset. As you well know, the saying goes, 5th time is a charm. Wait, no it doesn't. Okay, but point being, it finally worked. I shit you not, I have no idea why it worked. I even tried to see if I could make it fail again. I wanted to know how solid it was when it started working, and I was even unable to get it to fail again. It just continued to work. The first thing that came to mind with room scale VR with full positional tracking was Fallout 4 VR. I started this game as quickly as possible because I honestly at this point did not trust the lighthouse tracking would even hold up for a whole session, and got to playing the game as soon as I could. Fallout 4 VR looked awful. No, it wasn't the same problem as Elite Dangerous, and it certainly wasn't as much of a disappointment. Rather, this time around, it's the game's aliasing that was shining through prominently. Every single edge, ridge, and line would shimmer to fuck, and the staircasing along diagonal lines was strong. I can partly forgive this, since my resolution settings were still cautious. Resolution quality at 0.5 in PyTool with a setting of 56% in SteamVR, which oddly would amount to a resolution of about 3/4 of the headset's native display resolution. Keeping that in mind, I still wondered why Bioshock Infinite looked so damn good with settings that weren't far from this. I was also baffled at how this time Fallout 4 VR didn't look much different from when running it on the VIVE or the Rift. I should have stopped the game in order to increase my resolution scales, but I didn't because I was afraid the goddamn PiMax runtimes would lose positional tracking again and have to make me do 5 more ritual rain dances to get it working again. I also played this game with the field of view setting on large, and in this instance, that large field of view was the most detrimental to the experience. Only once did I actually notice anything of use in my outside view, someone walking down the steps in front of a house far to my left, but for the most part, I kept being distracted over and over and over by heavily distorted and blurred nearby walls, objects, and scenery. I think the combination of this being room scale VR and the more even brightness in this game is what made the distorted outer edges of the PiMax a lot more prominent than anything I tried so far. Like everything else I did in this headset, for fuck's sake I could barely read shit. I had to bring up that Pip-Boy almost point blank to the tip of my nose to finally make out what the text says. At this point I started wondering why I'm getting this issue again, since Fallout 4 VR should be better adapted to keep the text readable in VR, and it actually is, which led me to believe that the pixel pattern used in these displays produces additional problems with the readability of text. Fuck, there is no reason I shouldn't be able to read the Pip-Boy at about a forearm's length. I can in the other headsets, why not this one? This is not a UI rescale issue, there's something different about these screens that is making text a lot less readable. As far as the gameplay goes, it was very standard. The tracking worked surprisingly well, given I had successfully configured the base stations, and aside from my controllers having one slight momentary freakout, everything went fairly well. The game's performance was impeccable, and I didn't really notice any visible frame drops, but that is probably a testament to my cautious settings rather than an indication of Fallout 4 VR's actual performance. I'm sure if I cranked things up, I would have started to get degraded performance. After this session, the only thing I could think of is how this game would have been pretty much identical in every way in the Oculus Rift or the HTC VIVE, minus the awfully distorted edges of my outer view and the unreadable text. I pretty much didn't find any benefit to playing Fallout 4 VR with a PiMax 8K. I wasn't as disappointed as I was when I tried Elite Dangerous, but I still wasn't impressed one bit. Something that did keep up, and it's something you're supposed to expect from VR anyway, is that natural depth perception. Again, Fallout 4 VR joined the list of games that gave me this realistic, pleasant sense of depth, the kind that only VR can give you, a stereoscopic image that actually gives you a tactical advantage over 2D. Now, I was about to wrap up my session there, but I thought of one last thing I should do. This is a game I've played using the Oculus DK1, the Oculus DK2, the HTC VIVE, and the Oculus Rift. That would be Alien Isolation. There's a game mode in there that I've regularly used to test how a system and a VR headset performs after significant changes, and I figured it would be imperative that I try the same thing again with the PiMax 8K. I went ahead and launched Alien Isolation, specifically the Survivor Mode's map known as The Basement. Now, this isn't quite first-party VR since support for the commercial VR headsets was implemented by a patch called Mother VR created by Nibre VR, but as far as the experience of playing Isolation in VR goes, it's got a very much out-of-the-box feel, and it won't come with the problems you typically get running an unsupported game through VorpX, for example. Mother VR simply restores all of the game's experimental VR features along with several improvements that simply take it as close as possible to a first-party title. So here I am spawning in the basement for the nth time in 4 years using my 5th headset, and I could tell something right away. I'm not that impressed. See, the scenery in the basement is pretty much burned into my mind. I've seen it so many times through so many displays and lenses that I've come to know exactly what to expect from it and when improvements are supposed to be made. This rendition I got in the PiMax 8K was slightly better, but only slightly. Having the game super sampling at 150%, I was expecting far more from it. But this was only a slither of an improvement over the HTC VIVE and Oculus Rift. The cool thing about this last session is my positional tracking was still working, so I finally got to do some seated VR with positional, thus eliminating the need to recenter my view every 5 minutes due to tracking drift. Again, as with everything else I did during these tests, this fucking text. Not only is the UI really scrunched up in this game because of the ginormous field of view, but for fuck's sake, the text in here looked like little tiny barcodes rather than actual text. In other games, I was able to make out or guess what things say, but in here, forget it. It was absolutely, completely unreadable. Even at the Survivor Mode end screen, I couldn't read my completion time, which is actually something they write in larger characters. Now, this session did bring back a little bit of hope. First, that depth perception. Spot on. It's nice to feel like that xenomorph is actually 9 feet tall and probably a lot heavier than you. The visuals were in fact superior to the 2 other headsets. I did make use of the large field of view again, but by now I'd just worked up the might to ignore those awfully blurred outer edges, so it affected me less. I played through the mission, completing it in one of my best times so far, and if it counts for something, I had that same shockwave sent through my nerves as I've always had when I play any part of this game. Isolation is amazing in virtual reality, and that also applies to the PiMax 8K. So, after 5 very different gameplay experiences and quality time spent with this headset at work, I can safely say that I'm bloody glad I didn't dish out $900 on one of these. Yes, I very much appreciated having this unit for a whole weekend, and I enjoyed going through a bunch of games that I know with it. But down the line, the PiMax 8K has so many issues that are akin to the development days of VR, issues that I'm no longer used to facing, that whatever upsides this headset came with, those issues easily overshadow the positives and confirmed I wouldn't ever want to buy one of these. The most impressive aspect, the device's resolution, doesn't necessarily always manifest itself, and it's heavily overshadowed, albeit damaged, by the most obnoxious aspect. The horribly distorted outer field of view comes in the way so often that you're left wondering why you're even wearing a headset so much larger and so much more demanding than its commercial counterparts, the Vive or the Rift. The image scaling in this headset is handled very strangely, and I'm almost convinced by now that despite the displays having a greater resolution, the quality of the panels is inferior to the point where the first generation headsets are still able to compete very effectively. The biggest recurring factor that indicated this to me was the readability of text, which was simply awful in this unit. I've been through a progression of 3 headset generations, the DK1, the DK2, and the first commercial generation, the Rift and the VIVE. Each generation resulted text being more readable, not less, so I'm really awestruck in a bad way when it comes to that aspect. Keep in mind that despite a double 4K resolution, the problem we have here is that because the outer edges of the field of view are so poorly unwrapped, giving a distorted view, the part of the image you want to be looking at covers just about 50 to 60% of the screen. The mangled part of the horizontal field of view lies in that remaining 40 or 50%. This means that if you're going to compare pixel densities between this headset and the VIVE and the Rift, which use up to 90% of their screens for the main portion of your field of view, you won't find that much of a difference in detail between PiMax and its competitors. Effectively, you're getting 2160 by 2160, plus the rest for those distorted outer edges. It's good, but it's not as good as you'd probably expect from full 4K display panels. Factor in the many rain dances I had to do to beg this headset to detect my base stations, and we've got a pretty solid deal breaker. I would have felt terrible having spent almost $1,000 on a headset that wants to squat my Vive hardware, both base stations and controllers, only to get a result that feels like a makeshift VR setup that's trying to give you a glimpse at the future in VR field of view and resolution, only to mostly fail at it by its own limitations and flaws. If you're personally looking for a VR headset, or even more importantly, if you're looking to upgrade your current VR experience, I'd suggest you avoid the PiMax 8K, as it's really not a product that has, to me, justified its enormous price tag. You'll be sent into the development days of VR, and if it's not something you experienced in the past, this can come with many issues and frustrations that go with them. You're better off getting one of the current day mainstream headsets like the Vive or the Rift, or just wait until the second generation by Valve and Oculus. Believe me, I wanted to like this headset, and the specs looked insanely promising, but it's clearly fallen very short of its claims. I do hope you found this first impressions video useful. If you do choose to get your hands on a PiMax 5K Plus or an 8K headset, when you get the chance to try stuff with it, I'd love to hear what you thought about it in the comments. I understand that what I see here is strictly my opinion, and maybe others out there enjoy their PiMax. Do let everyone know down below. And you've been watching Stereo 3D Productions, folks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.